I know it feels like there's a new browser every week, but I promise this one's different. This isn't just another Chrome wrapper or somebody forking Firefox and giving it a new flavor. This is an actual, from the ground up, new browser. And oh boy, is it controversial. This video is going to be quite a journey where I go from really skeptical, really concerned, to starting to kind of get it. So make sure you stick through the whole thing because I did not think this was going to go the way it did. And huge shout out to the people from Ladybird who hung out during the stream and gave me lots of feedback and insight so I could cover this properly. Because man, this is a weird browser and God, is the history of how we got here strange. So let's dive in. I want to get one thing clear ASAP, 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 instantly. Because I've already seen people being like, oh great, another Electron or Chromium wrapper. Nope. They have been very, very clear in many places. What does the no code from other browsers bit really mean? The focus of the Ladybird project is to build a new browser engine from the ground up. We don't use code from Blink, WebKit, Gecko, or any other browser engine. For historical reasons, the browser uses various libraries from the Serenity OS project, which we'll be talking about in a bit too, but they had a strong culture of writing everything from scratch. Culture is a running theme here, as you guys will start to see. There was a huge announcement recently, both Ladybird's existence, but more importantly, that they have a nonprofit backing them. So they have a real chance. Also, I need to command, when I command minus, you can see how this is supposed to look. But how funny is it that people building a new browser that supposedly works great on low performance machines, that it overflows text incorrectly on their, I'm amused. Also love the AI generated image here. Take a look at that logo and the very functional USB Zalgo port. Great stuff. But it's a noble goal. Having a more varied set of browser engines should theoretically allow for the web to continue to innovate and thrive, but it's not that simple. Before I go any further, I do need to call out the controversies that have me a little bit biased here, because I'm not a perfect person. I can get biased, and I've seen some very rude things from the maintainers of this project, specifically the ones that came from Serenity OS. There was a pull request in 2021 where an innocent developer made a minor nitpick where they changed a very small thing. And I know people are going to freak out, like gender neutral, progressive, whatever. Sure. Look at how innocent this change was. To prevent this, remove a non from the wheel group, and he will no longer be able to run bin su. From what I understand, the maintainer who wrote this was not a native English speaker. And in the language that they speak, there was no concept of they. It was just he or she. So they wrote he, where in English, they is the grammatically correct thing. This isn't about gender neutrality. This isn't about progressive politics. This has nothing to do with anything other than being grammatically correct. Because in English, you use they for that, not he for that. That's just how English works. But since the words gender neutral appeared in the name of this PR, it seems like good old Kling's head exploded. This project's not an appropriate arena to advertise your personal politics. Yeah? And it gets worse because another maintainer, after this came up again recently, Dennis wrote, update outdated male-specific language. The pronouns they, them are a better choice, and as Serenity does not cater only to men. Yeah, fair. But the response here from a maintainer, we have had the long-standing rule in our project that we do not concern ourselves with controversial topics as to not alienate anyone who would like to join the project. This is, no. To respond like this to a grammatical fix is to make it political. This was not political until y'all started writing essays about it, then freaking out on Twitter and Mastodon and shit about it. So wanted to come out and say, this is dumb. We were trying to fix a grammatical error, but thankfully when somebody else filed the same PR with grammar fixes, it actually got merged. Same exact changes. They changed from he to it because this is a user account, so it's not a user, so it's technically more correct there. They changed his to there. They changed he is to they are. They made another change here to just make things flow a little bit better and changed him to it here. But since they labeled it as grammar fixes, it got merged in. So this seems like a combination of non-native English speakers, poor understanding of politics, and a desire to have a platform to spread bullshit. So wanted to call that out because I don't want to be a platform for that same bullshit to spread. I think having good grammar in your stuff and having people offer to correct it for you for free isn't something you should get so political about. Just wanted to quickly point that out because these maintainers seem to die on hills a lot, which makes sense when you refuse to use any existing technologies building a browser. I'm bringing this up not because I want to signal to the far left that I'm an extremist too or anything like that. This is very simply that I think the perspective of these maintainers is worth considering. And the same way they get angry about people changing he to they to be grammatically correct, they seem to be angry about all of the existing solutions for the web, which is why they're building their own, even though they're not great at CSS and HTML. So yeah, I think understanding that about these developers and their mindset will be very helpful as we go forward, because they like pushing back on things that are generally accepted because they want to do something different. Let's do it. So why do we care? Well, the main thing I mentioned before is the news button works. Oh, more things that they did wrong. These aren't links. So I command clicked news. It opened a new tab, but it didn't actually go to it. It just stayed on the top. Great. I know writing web stuff is hard, but yeah. The Ladybird browser initiative is the important piece here. Hello, friends. Today I wanted to share with you our plans for the next chapter of Ladybird, the truly independent open source web browser that we've been developing from scratch for the past few years. Ladybird uses a brand new engine based on web standards without borrowing any code from other browsers. It started as a humble HTML viewer for the Serenity OS hobby project, but since then, it's grown into a full cross-platform browser project supporting Linux, macOS, and other Unix-like systems. We can already do some of our daily browsing with Ladybird, like managing GitHub issues and pull requests, as well as commenting on HN. The browser is improving every day as our community of contributors are actively fixing bugs and adding features, but it's still very far from finished. We want to turn Ladybird into a browser that you can use every day for all your web-related tasks. It should be fast, stable, support web standards, and protect your privacy. A browser for you. In order to help us achieve this goal, we've created the Ladybird Browser Initiative, a 501c3 charity, nonprofit, tax-exemptable status pending, to drive work on the browser and make it easier for supporters of all shapes and sizes to sponsor development. Can't help but laugh at the thing we just read. Unlike traditional business models that rely on monetizing the user, Ladybird is funded entirely by sponsorships and donations from companies and individuals who care about the open web. Our nonprofit will not pursue corporate deals or revenue outside of unrestricted donations. The software and the source code will be available for free forever. Our board will consist of experts from a diverse range of worldviews and skill sets, not donors. We are starting small and will be adding more directors this year. So here are the directors. Andreas Kling from Serenity OS, who's also worked on Safari, the Nokia WebKit build, and KHTML in the past. And Chris Wanstruth, who is the, if you don't already know, the original co-founder and CEO of GitHub. So knows the stuff with open source and clearly wants to make the space more diverse for the browser engines at the very least. Exciting to see actual money being put in to new browser initiatives. Just feels like the people building new browsers are inherently a little bit weird. Yeah. Apparently, they're not expecting this to ship until 2026. Bold. I will say any prediction that's more than 3 weeks is always wrong. So I cannot imagine any software dev correctly predicting 2 years ahead like that. But theoretically, this will be ready summer 2026. But I'm not going to wait. I want to try now. So let's find it on GitHub and see if we can get it to build. Code, clone. And while that's cloning, we will take a look at how to build the Qt Chrome on macOS. Oh, that was faster than I expected. Okay, AppKit's what's used on Mac, so we don't need to install Qt. I like that they're not using Qt on Mac. That's nice, because Qt on Mac sucks. Qt in general sucks, but nice to avoid it on Mac. Yeah, I'm curious where they're actually using FFmpeg in here, so we're going to hunt. It's their media decoder. So if you're watching media, they're just directly calling FFmpeg, it seems. Their playback layer is just using FFmpeg. Checks out. Don't reinvent the wheel, just the browser. Yeah, I will say I love that the line is they won't use anything that was built for another browser, but they'll use things that were built for not other browsers. Like they'll still use Qt, they'll still use FFmpeg, they'll still use all those other tools. Just like a weird arbitrary thing to draw the line on. Am I missing something? What is the flex about not using other browser code? Yeah, I don't know of any good argument for not using other browser code. I've heard a lot of people mad that Chrome took over the web, and now that Chrome has taken over the entirety of like Internet Explorer stuff, where Edge is now built on top of Chromium. We have new browsers like Arc and Opera, all building on top of Chromium. The only other engines effectively are Safari, which is a nightmare, and Firefox, which I know a lot of y'all like, but is even more of a nightmare. So we're in one of my favorite XKCDs. Standards. The thing is, there are 3 competing standards, one of which is winning. 3, but I don't like the one that's winning. We're going to make a 4th one. Yeah, that's what's happening now. How's the build going? Yeah, my computer's working hard right now. Still no fans. It's insane that this can just be full gun out CPUing like that and not even spinning up the fans much. Kind of nuts. Oh, as I said that, I'm starting to hear some fans from my laptop. Oh God, first feedback. That is the worst browser icon I've ever seen. What's this 2004 ass shit with like the cringy 3D render? I know what we're gonna go to first. Space Jam. Not looking good. Failed to load, failed to load, failed to decode. Web content process crashed. Great start. Okay. The rebuild seems to be working. It's not rendering SVGs, which is expected. Shit. It just needed to be force closed and reset. But now we made it all the way to Space Jam. Cool. And they said GitHub works. But since it just crashed for me, I'm going to question that. Oh, it's working. Oh God, the scroll performance is awful. It's like chugging. Yeah, it's fully utilizing 4 of my cores right now just to like scroll. Oh God. Oh God. How does it handle reflowing? Oh, it kind of handles reflowing okay. It doesn't handle spacing and flexbox, right? So if we compare this to github.com, like they're not handling the CSS for that spacing correct at all. Do they have an inspector? Yeah, and it's somehow even slower than I would have expected. Like I get that performance comes later, and the fact that I'm using this in like a dev build means it's going to be slower. Can I do a production build? Or is this that build? Look at the CMake presets JSON file. Sure. There's an enable GPU painting in help command. See my CPU usage. Not as bad this time. That's a good sign. A lot of unhandled stuff because, again, they wrote their own JavaScript engine too. Like they're not using V8. They're not using WebKit. They're not using anything. The project types release according to the JSON. Okay, that's what I figured. Yeah, I don't know if I can do anything to make this faster, which honestly makes me concerned because if something is new, broken, and faster, that's fine. But if it's new, broken, and slower, making it fast later is tough. Usually things start fast and then they get slow and then we patch it to make it reasonably fast again. Use the Skia painter. Apparently Skia is the fastest, but I thought that we weren't reusing anything. Why are they reusing Skia, which is a browser rendering engine? Why we need Ladybird? Probably should do this early because it's important to understand why they're building this. The web is one of the most important inventions of the modern era, fueling the growth of the internet and changing the way that many of us live, work, learn, and play. It's a technical marvel, both for what it enables us to do and the way it's built, collaboratively and in the open. It wasn't always this way, but today's web is a testament to the power of open standards and open source. In fact, it was open source, open standards, and healthy competition that pulled the web out of the dark days of the 2000s and into the innovation bonanza of the 2010s, when Google Chrome, heavily influenced by Firefox, started gaining mainstream momentum. Absolutely. Chrome was very, very inspired by Firefox. Today, every major browser engine is open source, which is wonderful, but there's still one issue. They're all funded by Google's advertising empire. Chrome, Edge, Brave, Arc, and Opera all use Chromium. Apple receives billions to make Google the default search engine in Safari. In Firefox, it's a similar deal where they receive hundreds of millions every year. The web is too essential to have one primary source of funding, and it's too important to have that source of funding be advertising. Many people say that it's impossible to build a new browser and that you can never unseat Google Chrome. Well, you don't have to unseat Google Chrome to make a difference. Firefox is proof of that. Firefox has never been the most popular browser, but it has majorly influenced every popular browser, and it's made the web a better place. As for whether you can build a new browser, it's already happening. That's why I believe that Ladybird, a new browser written completely from scratch, and the Ladybird Browser Initiative, which is a nonprofit funded exclusively by donations whose sole purpose is the development of the Ladybird browser, could make a difference. The world needs a browser that puts people first, contributes to open standards using a brand new engine, and is free from advertising's influence. That's why Chris has co-founded the Lady Browser Initiative with Andreas, and their families pledged $1 million to support Ladybird's dev. Believe in Ladybird, and I believe in Andreas' vision, and I hope you help to support an open, independent browser that supports you. Okay. I will say that if the goal is to make sure the influence of Chrome and advertising isn't steering the web too hard, re-implementing everything still to me doesn't feel like the right solution. And I still think starting from something else makes more sense. And my inner capitalist also struggles to separate the idea of like building things that put people first. Capitalism does a pretty solid job of this, where the thing that can make the most money because the people use it and like it the most tends to win. Advertising obviously screws with the incentive structure here, but it's a much more understandable version of the perspective here. I feel better having read this, and I probably should have started with it. It'd be nice if the homepage made these goals clearer too. It seems like the concern and the reason this project exists is fear that Google's advertising empire is driving the web and web standards too hard and too far forward. And other things like Safari and Firefox make way too much money from Google as well. And they want to be outside of Google's influence. Yeah, better. Still a little laggy, but better. Still has the same issues with those things. These pop up faster. The email address on the input here being misaligned is sending me. Like, it's just funny. This is absolutely fascinating. If we go back to like t3.gg, it showed the SVG and then it vanished when it actually rendered the page. Great sign. Oh, interesting message. Kling announced that they'll be using other libraries on Ladybird. That's why they forked out of Serenity. Fascinating. So Serenity OS's whole thing is they don't reuse anything. They reinvent everything themselves. But with this, they realize that they can't actually reinvent everything because it's too brutal to do. Oh shit, there's a maintainer here. Oh, I didn't know that you were the maintainer when you said that. Oh shit, thank you so much. Yeah, I have to force close after the command C. Learned that lesson, yes. So on macOS, by default, it uses iOS Surface plus Metal, but the Skia painter is... Okay, the painter would be a higher level than the Surface layer, so that makes sense. Yeah, interesting. I've seen more people in general like going deep on Metal, which if you don't know, Metal is the actual rendering engine for Mac and Apple stuff. It's their equivalent of something like a DirectX or a Vulkan, even though both of those also can hook into Metal. It's their one layer above the bare Metal. The Skia painter uses Metal. The other painter is pure CPU. Oh God. Oh God. And thank you, Ram, for pointing out that I missed that Rambo is one of the maintainers. Good stuff. If you hear, is there anything that you're particularly proud of that you think Ladybird does better than others that I could showcase here? It's doing its best. Cool. Safari hits a 97. The animation is smooth, which is an important piece here. Compared to here, it's a little jankier. And compared to Arc, which is Chrome, everything kind of tops out at 97 now, but at least it's smooth. According to the maintainer, it loads Acid 3 pretty well. We're working on getting there with the web platform test, but for now, getting the actual implementation working and all the web APIs implemented is a lot of work. That checks out. See no reason not to use JSC or V8. Yeah, the fact that they're doing their own JavaScript runtime is kind of... I don't even know if bold is the right word. I almost want to say insane. You know what we should check? Since I'm live right now, let's see how it handles my stream. Not expecting good news here. Twitch is a very heavy JavaScript app. We're getting a lot of things here. Oh boy. Oh shit, we're actually getting some messages in chat at least. So in YouTube probably aren't going to happen. At least chat works. If I pop out chat, I'm curious how that works by itself. Oh, the pop-out link just broke. Yeah, I know making a browser is hard, but like this kind of emphasizes just how insane a task it is. Try again. Window.open is quite the bear. Getting it to open a new window in the same process was fun. Oh God, yeah, I can't even imagine. Hey, this is working. I don't think it's loading Twitch's font though, but at least it's working. Yeah, iframes. I would not want to have to implement iframes, that's for sure. Oh, that's so Skia. God, that's so Skia. Oh, God. That hurts. I'm trying to select welcome and it's selecting stream chat. Oof. This is like a giant Flutter app. I'm in pain. Yes, this is very early. I mentioned before, I recorded earlier in the video, they're not even expecting an alpha till 2026. We're 2 years early. This is why I rarely think it's worth it to reinvent everything. Because when you reinvent everything, it takes so long to even know if your ideas work or not. Because if I'm building something, we'll say this is something, and we want to build something. Something has a lot of parts. We'll say, like, this is the part that we're most excited about, but this is built on other foundations. This is going to look a lot like a certain XKCD diagram that I really like. So let's say this is what we're building. And we have all of these dependencies, all of these parts that are necessary for something to work. Let's say we decide we're going to make every single one of these blocks ourselves. What happens if we think that this block is working? And then once we build this block, it turns out that there's an incompatibility with our understanding of how these blocks work. So if like the relationship between these is more complex than we had initially thought, it's possible all the work we did on this foundational block is just bad. So if we are deciding to invent everything ourselves, it's very possible we build this whole scaffold, we get up to the top, we're building this, and we realize, oh shit, this doesn't work because it makes assumptions about things that aren't true, and the only way to fix it is to rebuild this block on the bottom. Now let's say instead we used existing things. For this, we used V8, the JS engine. For this, we used Qt, the runtime. Here we used Skia, which they are actually using, credit to them for it. Here we used WebKit or something else alongside it. Here we used your own stuff that you invented. Now that we're using these existing blocks, yes, we can no longer say we wrote this whole something ourselves, but the likelihood that we get this far up before realizing something we did before is wrong is significantly lower. If you have parts that work, even if you plan to eventually swap this out for a different thing in the future, at the very least, it's way easier to debug the other pieces as you're building them. And the concern I have for a project like this, these like massive rewrites or these massive reimaginings, is that they almost never work because they can't encapsulate the full picture until so far along. It takes so long to get to a point where the thing functions that it becomes hard to know what is and isn't even working. It's truly difficult to know, like when the page crashes, yeah, we get an error, but is that error actually that layer, or is it failing because something below it is a dependency that doesn't work as expected? Like, where do the failures exist and what isn't working becomes significantly harder when you're building at this scale. And when you're building something this big, it's more important than ever to be really thorough on what does and doesn't work if you want to make these parts successfully. There's a good counterpoint from chat. On the other hand, if you own all the code, you can debug all of it too. It's a massive pain point that library X is doing it wrong, so I'll just work around it instead of fixing it. Yep, very real. One of the interesting things about Ladybird is that they chose to not use an existing JavaScript runtime. Most browsers are using something like JavaScript Core from the WebKit world or V8 or any of the other many JavaScript runtimes. But they wrote their own, libjs. And it's actually, according to test262, the most compatible with existing web standards. V8, which is what we all use because it's what's in Chrome, the most common browser, that's only at 81%, which is very interesting. They're cheating a bit because they enable a bunch of experimental features by default, and test262 has proposal tests in. So if I was to enable all the experimental features in another thing like SpiderMonkey, then they would be similar results. Good to know, though. Yeah, one of the big points is that they have temporal enabled without flags. V8 has it, but they don't enable it, so it's not shown in the tests. All very good points. Can I just run libjs? Ooh, there's a REPL for it. What I wanted was to be able to run it locally so I could actually see the performance. Oh, it's a JS binary in the repo. Interesting. Meta ladybird sh run JS. Cool. We have yet another JavaScript runtime. Very interesting. Apparently they don't have JIT, which is very interesting. If I was to make a quick JS file, I'm so curious now. Console.log, hello nerds. Nice. Yeah. That's my concern. For those who are just listening and not watching, the time taken on Ladybird's libjs to generate 100,000 prime numbers was 1.48 seconds. And in both Bun and Node, it took 0.047 seconds. I'm not pumped about that. So with no JIT on Node, it's closer to 0.25 seconds. But man, kind of sad because again, like if I go to my diagram, this is my concern is instead of using like JSC or some existing standard for the JavaScript layer, they went with libjs. And even if they can get it fully compat, which according to this, like they're doing a great job with compatibility. It seems to support most features. However, it's not very fast. And this is, again, the issues is if their alternative to WebKit is fine but kind of slow, if their alternative to libjs is fine but kind of slow, these things are going to compound and they're going to result in a lackluster experience. And this isn't because rolling your own is bad. This is because rolling your own while also reinventing this many parts at once is bad. It's like, I'm going to invent my own car, but we're not going to reuse any of the things other cars use. So now you're making your own engine. Now you're making your own wheels, you're making your own tires, you're making your own frames and frame assemblies, you're making your own key fobs and your own key systems. Once you hit a certain point, it's hard to know what is or isn't even working. And that's the concern I have with a project of this size, that reinventing everything basically guarantees you have a lot of these types of issues where, yeah, it's fully compatible, but it takes 1.48 seconds. Personally, when doing big like swing for the fences projects like this, I try to focus in on one subset. Even something like Bun. Bun's an all-in-one toolkit for JavaScript. I thought Bun was reaching too much because it's trying to be a runtime, a bundler, and a fully node-compatible solution, as well as like providing their own SQLite layer and doing all these other things. So they're trying to be like a standard library too. The fact that Bun is trying to do all these different things at once is too much. That said, it's all contained in a very clean, isolated box of this is just JavaScript. This takes in JavaScript and it outputs whatever the JavaScript runs. And it's built on top of JSC. Although Bun is a runtime, it is literally just JSC, but they have added a bunch of hacks, deops, and optimizations to get out of JSC and then run it natively using the code that they've written too. So that's just the way I think about these things. When you're building something bold, it's important to get it in a shape where people want to use it so you can start figuring these things out, I would argue, as early as possible. And the concern I have with a project like this is that it's more focused on the principles than the quality of the experience the users can have. By not using existing solutions for so much stuff, they have guaranteed it will take significantly longer for this to be viable and actually good. And it's going to take way longer to identify what is, and more importantly, isn't working. So that's the concern I have. While it's incredibly cool that they have this level of compatibility, that the acid test I ran earlier, but like the fact that they get 97 out of 100 on acid 3, which is the expected result, the fact that their compatibility here is as good as it is, it's cool, but it's not necessarily good. And that's the concern I have, is that someone else in chat actually said this, and I think this is a good point. They think I'm missing the point of the project. Rewriting everything is the point. That's the issue I have. Even if your goal is to rewrite everything, I would argue it's better to focus on individual parts. Like, instead of we're a new browser that reinvented everything, why not we forked Chrome and we're rewriting this part? Now we're rewriting this other part. Now we're rewriting this other part. And eventually you can break out of the loop. And that's the concern I have, is that when you decide from the start that you're going to redo everything, you end up in hell trying to support everything. And it becomes harder and harder to realize what is and isn't working. This is a good point from YouTube chat, that rewriting everything could be easier than doing the hard thing and trying to work around existing solutions. Yeah, but it also lets you isolate those individual parts. I don't know. I could be wrong on this, but I find it really difficult to believe that a project like this can succeed, because it will if the goal of this project is to just be another browser that isn't using any of the code that's in Chrome or Firefox. It can succeed. Like, this has a pretty solid chance of becoming another browser. But I don't think reinventing the browser is the solution. I really like the car analogy, and I see people going back to that again and again. If we have a car, I'm going to do a really good job of drawing a car here for you guys. Isn't that a great car? I think I did good. So now we have this car. Let's say people are getting tired of the car. Specifically, they're getting frustrated that basically every car is the same. Even if you're getting a Kia or a Toyota or anything else, all of the tires and wheels are the same. All of the engines are coming from the same company. All the windows are being made by the same company. All of the parts of the car are sourced from the same places, regardless of what logo's on the front of the car. So our solution is we're going to reinvent the car. We're going to rebuild the car, and it's going to work just like any other car. It's going to follow all of the standards and all the things we expect from other cars, but we're going to replace every single part along the way. So we're not going to use the wheels that everyone else is using. We're going to use blue ones instead. We're not going to use the hood and the framing that every other car uses. We're going to roll that ourselves too. We're not going to use the windows everyone else is using. We're going to make these our own crazy proprietary solution. It'll be open source, but it's going to be its own thing. We're going to use our own frames for the axles. We're going to use all our own everything. But wait, some of these things are hard. Oh, yeah, it turns out wheels are actually really hard. So we'll go back to the original. Oh, it turns out manufacturing your own body is really hard. We'll go back to the original for that too. This process becomes so chaotic so quickly. And I think it's more important to not just reinvent for the sake of it, but actually sit down and think, like, what's wrong with the car? If you're trying to build something that meets all of the exact same standards of the car, but has nothing in common with it, that just feels like a bad goal to me. I just don't philosophically align with that. That feels like such a for the sake of it task. If the goal is to have a car that on the inside is different, like how it was made was different, but it does and works exactly the same, meh. But if the issue is, you know what? Everybody relying on the same tire company is risky, Because if that company goes out of business or they raise the price or they do any of these other things, that's a high risk. We don't want the entire world relying on one wheel. That's a fair point. And you know what we should do when that is the case? We should make other companies for tires and wheels. But I'm tired of every car having the same wheels, so we're going to rebuild the car. It just doesn't feel like the right mindset. It feels like the principle of wanting something different, honestly, for the sake of it. And that's what's hard for me to get behind is projects for the sake of it. Even something like Linux. Linux was created because Unix had great ideas, but it was proprietary and people couldn't use it on a lot of the things they wanted to without paying massive licenses and dealing with it. So they invented something compatible so that they could have those parts and do what they wanted with them. It was out of need. There was a specific thing that the existing solutions didn't provide, in this case, free and open source. And Linux was created in order to be that part. But that's what is missing for me here is the motivation. I just don't see it. Like, is the goal just not let Chrome win? Somebody's arguing that what I'm saying doesn't make sense. It's only true if we 100% know that existing systems are optimal forever. But they're trying to implement existing systems. That's the point of libjs and test 262. They are more compatible with the existing standards than V8 according to these tests. They're not doing something new. If you have two new cars and one of them is a perfect recreation of a 1990s Kia, but using entirely different manufacturing, entirely different every part, but it looks and operates exactly the same. Or you have a car that's a Kia, but with the body modded to look different. The modded Kia is more different and more innovative and more likely to push cars forward than the perfect clone that uses everything different internally. So if the goal is to let cars be different in decades, the solution should be to change the cars, not to reinvent the car from scratch today. In fact, I'm using one of these browsers now. The browser I'm using right now, Arc, looks nothing like Chrome. It operates nothing like Chrome. This is a huge innovation in how I browse the web, but it's still based on Chrome. It's just that I don't see a goal here, and that's what's confusing to me. Any project, especially one that raises money, I like to see a concrete goal from them. And it seems like the goal here isn't to be better or different in any way beyond being independent. And that's tough for me. I will admit that Mozilla kind of dropped the ball here, because Mozilla used to be very independent, and they still technically are. Everything's open source. You can do what you want with it. But they rely a lot on grants they get from Google to function at all at this point. And the point of confusion for me is that it's hard to see where this goes or what benefit exists as a result of it. Like, what would success look like for Ladybird? The Ladybird site. That's kind of funny that the background doesn't render right on Ladybird for the Ladybird site. I get it though. The issue I have is like, you should start with what's wrong with the one car. If the issue is that the standard for the car isn't open enough, cool. Fork it and make a more open version, or start re-implementing the parts so that you can have something that meets that goal. But the goal shouldn't be just independence for the sake of it. And if it is, then you should take the thing that works and then make that independent. If the goal is diversification of browser engines, then make a new browser engine. Don't make a new browser. A really good point from chat that I haven't emphasized before. They're not reinventing, they're re-implementing. That's a very, very important distinction. Don't shoot the dream down. Like, I don't mean to be, but I would like to know what the dream is my issue. The dream isn't clear here. This is the maintainer. They're making a new browser engine, the UI of the browser secondary. Then I guess I'm confused why the JavaScript engine would also be part of this. Like, why also re-implement JavaScript too? The goal is not let a single tech company determine the future of the web. Yeah, that's fine, but there's other ways to do that. I would argue even something like Bun is doing a great job of that. Since Bun is its own runtime, now they have some say in what standards get implemented. Going with a data-oriented approach on the heap. Yeah. If we wanted to make a browser, we'd make Arc. We wanted to make a browser engine, a replacement for Gecko, WebKit, and Blink. Interesting. Okay, interesting framing. I still think re-implementing the JS layer is a weird choice then. I'm happy to see that this, like, re-implement everything has been walked back a good bit overall. That's why it's not part of Serenity anymore. They're realizing, like, re-implementing the entire browser is insane. If the focus is on the engine and everything else is just a consequence of it, I'm a lot cooler with that. But it seems like there's some baggage here still too. Yeah, it's also, as Dak said, it's not clear on the site at all. Like, it seems like it's going for an independent web browser. Brand new browser from scratch. Does the word engine appear? Later was a brand new browser and web engine. That's the issue, is it is definitely being marketed as a browser. I do like that they call out that the focus is building a new engine. They're using some of the same third-party libs that other browsers use, but they'll never adopt another browser engine instead of building their own. Better. Swapping, okay, so it's like largely that it's too late, that libjs is so deeply embedded and that the DOM is garbage collected, so swapping out would not be possible. Very interesting. I feel a little better having Rambo in here. He has helped me understand better. I feel like, Rambo, tell me if I'm overspeaking my role here. It feels like the goal of the website in the marketing is almost intentionally to overscope and overhype in order to get people like me to talk about it and potentially get some funding for the project. But it seems like the focus isn't actually the browser part of browser and web engine. It's just the web engine part. And theoretically, if someone else came out that was working on a browser and said, you know what, we're going to swap our engine out for what Ladybird is doing, that would almost be like a blessing for you guys, because you could stop focusing on the browser and start focusing on where your actual energy is, which is the web engine. In order to make sure it works, you need a UI, so you're building it. But if somebody else had built that UI or was willing to build it, you guys would gladly drop it and then go focus on the engine. That's my assumption here. That is not correct. Let me know. I could be entirely off here. Sure, but no one's doing it. Yeah, I figured that no one was doing that. I'm trying to understand the motivation. This is a hard project to parse, okay? The idea of rebuilding the web without like well-stated goals in it. You're going to continue as if the project's the entire browser, but the core is the web engine. I just am struggling to see the why here. It could just be a fundamental difference in how my brain works. But as I sit here, it's hard for me to swallow why this is worth the effort in this direction. That said, I have massive respect for the team for taking on a challenge this absurd, and specifically massive respect for Rambo for showing up and taking heat that I didn't even expect to dish and is certainly not his job. So fantastic work, Rambo, for coming in and properly explaining what the perspective of yourself and the team is. I just struggle to see a future for it. Yeah, much love to Rambo. Shout out to them for coming back here and pushing this. The core is building out a web engine and making sure the standards can be implemented. That's a very fair framing here. If I was the one building the web page, we're concerned about the web. As standards get more complex and browser engines get more locked down, it's hard to imagine the innovation we've come to expect and love. We're building Ladybird to make sure the standards, one, can still be implemented by independent devs and teams, and two, can continue evolving in a way that benefits every user. While we might not be the best browser, that's not our goal. We want to be the standards browser that proves the web isn't something owned by Google. Like, if this was the pitch, I'd be much, much different in how I discuss this. But this wasn't the pitch. The pitch wasn't, we're concerned the web might not be implementable by independents in that Google owns it. The pitch was, we built a truly independent browser. To reframe my alternative, I would open this with can we build a browser without Google? Google's influence on the web can't be ignored. Advertising should not drive every decision about browsers, standards, and how we experience the web. That's why we're building Ladybird. If this was the statement, can we build a browser without Google? Google's influence on the web can't be ignored. Advertising should not drive every decision about browser standards and how we experience the web. That's why we're building Ladybird. If that was the homepage, I'd be cool with that. But it's not. I like the idea that they're not pushing to be the best browser. They're pushing to be a separate, independent, open browser. Is nice. It's just so hard for me to see a path where this gets adopted. This doesn't feel like Linux to me. It feels like FreeBSD. This feels like it's more for the sake of it than truly pursuing that goal. I'm not sure about this. I'm happy to see more innovation in the web, but I don't know if this is the path there. Yeah, Linux started as just for me. I actually like that, though, because Linux was solving a specific problem that Linus had. He wanted to use Unix and things he wasn't allowed to use Unix for, so he created Linux so he could use it for those things. When you're solving a specific pointed problem you have like that, that's very different from, if Linux already existed, then he wouldn't have made Linux. What would the Linux of web browsers look like, though? That's a very, very good question. And I think the answer is Firefox when it dropped. When Firefox came out, all the existing browsers were closed source messes. And as that article correctly pointed out, the importance of Firefox is insane. It's majorly influenced every popular browser, and it's made the web better. When Firefox came out, it was one of the first, probably arguably, almost certainly the first real open source browsers, one of the first big open source projects. And that was huge because they wanted something that was entirely outside of the existing like Netscape and IE ecosystems. And very quickly, Firefox got to a point where it was a better browser than the other ones. I didn't use Firefox, it was open source. I used Firefox in elementary school because it was the best browser to use. And since other browsers were bad for users, didn't have most of the features they wanted, were slow, were miserable, Firefox was able to fix these user experience failures, and open source was a mechanism to do that. So the closest thing we have to a Linux in the browser world was Firefox when it dropped. Here's one more post from Andreas that helps explain their perspective, specifically how we're building a browser when it's supposed to be impossible. So this is a blog post from Drew DeVault that is screenshotted in here. The reckless infinite scope of web browsers. Since the first browser war between Netscape and Internet Explorer, web browsers have been using features as their primary means of competing with each other. The strategy of unlimited scope and perpetual feature creep is reckless. It's been allowed to go on for far too long. I used wget to download all 1,217 pages of the W3C specifications, which have been published at the time of writing, of which web browsers need to implement a substantial subset in order to provide a modern web experience. I ran a word count on all of these specifications. How complex would you guess the web is? The total word count of the W3C spec is 114 million words at the time of writing. If you added all the combined word counts of C11, C++17, UEFI, USB 3.2, and POSIX specs, all 8,754 published RFCs, and the combined word count of everything on Wikipedia's list of longest novels, you'd be 12 million words short of the W3C spec. Okay, that's a hilarious thing. I conclude that it's impossible to build a new web browser. The complexity of the web is obscene. The creation of a new browser would be comparable in effort to the Apollo program or the Manhattan Project. It's impossible to implement the web correctly, implement the security, or, in their argument, at all. How is the Serenity OS team making such good progress on building their Ladybird browser when we've heard for years that it's impossible? I've seen this question a few times on sites like HN and Reddit, and I thought I'd offer my personal take on it. From my perspective, it comes down to 5 main things: stronger web spec, focus on vertical slices, deferring on performance work, I noticed, team culture, and having experienced leaders. The stronger web spec. We've come a long way from the wishy-washy days of HTML4 and CSS2. The ECMAScript, HTML, and CSS specs today are, for the most part, stellar technical documentation whose algorithms can be implemented with considerably less effort and guesswork than in the past. The architecture of Ladybird tries really hard to match the architecture described in the various web specs. This makes it significantly easier for new devs to get oriented, so they only have to learn one architecture instead of 2. There are still gaps, though, in some features that are less specified than others. Thankfully, there's an active community of editors at the W3C working on improvements. A fair amount of the work that we do on Ladybird involves adapting our code base to updates made by these spec editors. We try to do our part in improving the spec as well. The Ladybird devs often report spec bugs and sometimes make PRs to improve the specs directly. Not to mention that implementing a spec in a novel browser engine provides great validation that the spec's actually complete. We're also focusing on vertical slices. While the specs today are indeed better than ever before, it's still the case that many features span multiple specs, often with a subtle interaction difference between subsystems that may be understood by an implementer. If you try to build a browser one spec at a time, or even one feature at a time, you'd most likely run out of steam and lose interest altogether. So instead, we tend to focus on building a vertical slice of functionality. This means setting practical cross-cutting goals, such as let's get this twitter.com/awesomecling to load, or let's get login working on Discord, and other similar objectives. Working on a vertical slice helps maintain momentum, and it's highly motivating to see tangible improvements on real live websites as they progress. This is very much agreeable to me. Like, if your goal is implement, we go back to my diagram before with the blocks. If instead of implementing like the stuff below here, then here, then here, instead you're like, I'm just going to take this little section here. It's called a vertical slice. It's everything you need top to bottom. We might be missing the stuff on the left and the right, but we have enough to do this one task up top. At the very least, you know everything top to bottom is working, and it's also much more rewarding to do work in that way. Respect for that helps address a lot of my concern here. You might think this approach would produce a small collection of compatible sites and a vast desert of non-working things. What really happens is that the rising tide lifts all boats, and as we focus on improving one website, thousands of other sites start to improve as well. Deferring performance work. I'm curious what they have to say here. We're not putting much effort into optimizing Ladybird for perf. Instead, our primary focus is on addressing issues related to correctness and compatibility. That way we can be focused on making sure the browser works as intended before diving into optimizations. It's not that we don't care about performance. We want our browser to be fast and responsive eventually. It's a matter of making a disciplined choice to not spend too much time optimizing a product that doesn't work correctly yet. For example, while we might identify areas where we could potentially optimize the JS execution or rendering speeds, we consciously choose to prioritize fixing rendering bugs or compatibility issues with popular sites first. We do make exceptions for things that are unbearably slow. We don't want working on the browser to be unpleasant after all. In those cases, we'll invest time in addressing the most significant performance bottlenecks to maintain a tolerable dev experience. Notably, dev experience. Actually, browsing with this is not ready yet, but they don't even have benchmark scores yet. That's concerning. To not know that you're regressing or not, it's a little scary to me. Team culture is highly optimized and everyone has a can-do attitude. The team is distributed around the world. They all meet on Discord to chat and spur each other on, frequently collaborating and pitching in on each other's ideas. Everyone who works on Ladybird is encouraged to explore their own personal interests within the project. Most folks on the team have never worked or looked at browser code before joining, quickly becoming world-class browser devs. Since it's an offshoot from the Serenity OS project, it shares the same culture of accountability and self-reliance. We avoid third-party dependencies and build everything ourselves. That's just been changed. In part because it's fun, but also because it creates total accountability for what goes into our software. Also, an experienced leader, this is a bit of like a self-plug because they've worked on things at Apple and Nokia, so they have a strong understanding. While other people may look at the stack of technologies and specs that need to be combined to make the browser and feel overwhelmed, I've got a clear picture of how to put them together and make it work. Save a lot of time here by not worrying about whether it's possible and just getting straight to the work instead. Apparently, they primarily work between the seams. They don't believe our exact way of working is strictly transferable to other software projects, unless they are also a browser. With a small team of smart, focused individuals and a knowledgeable leader to guide them, you can build any software you want. Yeah, you can. But whether that software will be good is a whole different problem. Like, this is the ultimate tech spec as the product. Ladybird's value can be described by a spec sheet, which makes me inherently skeptical. To double down on the not invented here thing, they actually forked Ladybird from Serenity OS because they wanted to relax the not invented here policy. Instead of no third-party code, they will actually plan to leverage the greater OSS ecosystem. I will say I have the concern that since this project started with not invented here, there's a lot of almost like tech debt and legacy stuff that are decisions that were made because they chose to reinvent everything that now are kind of technical debt that makes continuing to implement and iterate harder. But there's a certain level of like, it's already done that you just eat and move forward accordingly. My gut feel is that if this was started today with the same mindset, certain parts, like specifically libjs, probably would not exist. The only thing they were reusing before was Qt. Basically everything else they built themselves, which is kind of nuts. But since then, they're not even supporting Serenity anymore. A lot has changed. I'm not convinced that the complexity and the security burdens of a JavaScript JIT are reasonable. And given the recent developments of Microsoft's Edge super duper secure mode, I'm interested in pushing for best effort JIT-less performance while keeping the code base simple. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. I am pretty much certain Ladybird is not the browser I'm ever going to use, but the concept of it being impossible to make a new browser is dumb. And if the goal of this is to challenge that concept, to take the people who say you can't do a new browser and prove you can, that's cool enough for me. Is it a thing I would ever use? No, because I'm actually kind of happy with Chrome, and the things I'm looking for aren't principled different changes on how these things should be made. What I'm looking for is a great experience going through the web, exploring things, finding things, sharing things, and more. And for me, Arc is that. But Ladybird and Arc are almost inarguably the opposite approaches to the goal of having a different browser, where if Ladybird does everything they want to correctly, it'll feel just like using Safari, but with all the tech being different internally. And if Arc succeeds with their goals, it's going to feel like a whole new way of exploring the web. But the goal of Ladybird was never to be a better, different, unique way of experiencing the web. It was to prove that the standards can be implemented. And if that's the goal here, cool. Update the homepage to say such. I have nothing else. Peace.